Welcome everyone. It's so great to be here today. It's my honor and privilege to moderate this conversation with the wonderful Professor Regina Lawrence, who'll be sharing some of the work that she's been working on as part of the working group that she's been leading for the Local News Impact Consortium. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Benjamin Toff. Wear a few different hats. I'm an associate professor at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. I'm also the director of the Minnesota Journalism Center, and I'm also the research chair for the Local News Impact Consortium, which is the organization that's organized this webinar. And I thought just before we get started, for those of you who are less familiar with the LNIC, I thought I would say a little bit about who we are, what we do, and share some of the resources with you before we dive into Regina's report. So I think one place to start, which would help for all of us, is if all of you who are joining us as participants, if you could introduce yourselves in the chat and just say a little bit about who you are and what brings you to the webinar today, what you're hoping to learn from it, any other details you think would be relevant. Damon has posted the link to the Local News Impact Consortium website there, where you'll find Regina's report, and you'll also find an overview of some of our other work. So one of the pieces that we recently published a couple months ago, which I think is relevant for the discussion today, is a piece that I wrote in early September entitled "A Shared Vocabulary for Local News Ecosystem Research," and it's an effort to sort of give a high-level overview of the kinds of work that the Impact Consortium does. The consortium essentially is a mix of different researchers, many of us from academic institutions, but also from the practitioner community, nonprofits, journalism support organizations, a lot of us who have known each other in different venues, who are often working on different aspects of local news ecosystem research. And a few of us came together about a couple years ago or a year and a half ago, at a sense that there's too much fragmentation going on in this community, that there's a lot of duplication of efforts, a lot of efforts sort of reinventing the wheel every time one of these studies was getting done. And we just felt like there was so much to be benefited by having stronger ties as a community, and working together to establish some best practices or some guidelines for how to do this work in a more rigorous way, so that we can hopefully collect more useful, valuable, consistent, rigorous measures of the health of our local news and information ecosystems. And that's really the focus of the consortium. Our work is spread out over a number of different working groups. The one that Regina has been leading, we've been referring to as essentially Newsroom Census, and that's the focus of today's webinar. And Regina will say a little bit more about what we mean by that. But I'm curious if we have a poll for all of you, just to give us a sense of what your own background is in this kind of work. But if you have any idea what we're talking about, and you've done some sort of version of a census in your own community or in other communities that you've done research in, just to give us a sense of where you're at, that would be helpful for us. The other working groups of the LNIC include a working group on audiences in the public that's led by Jesse Holcomb at Calvin University, that some of you may know. Jen Hendrickson at Washington State University leads a working group on studying employment in local news and best practices, best approaches to doing that. Damon Kiesau and Matt Weber at Mizzou and at Rutgers, respectively, they together lead a computational methods around measuring the content of local news working group. All of those are listed on our website. The last working group that is our newest working group, which is I don't think yet listed on our website because it's so brand new, is a working group around studying the economic impact of local news. That's led by Harsh Taneja at the University of Illinois. Other things we do as a consortium is really try to build ties across this research community. So if you're interested in joining, especially if you want to join our Slack channel, That's where we have, I forget exactly how many, we've got, I think 75 members or so, maybe more than that at this point. You're welcome to join us. Just there's a link to contact us to be added. There's also a really great resource on our website, a library of research studies around local news ecosystem research. There's a link there as well to take a look at that. And if you have a research study that's not included and you like for it to be included, on that page, there's a way to contact us to be added. So that's a broad overview of what the ecosystem, the Impact Consortium is. I want to turn things over now to Regina Lawrence. Regina is currently serving as the interim dean of the School of Journalism and Communication at the University of Oregon, where she's also research director of the Agora Journalism Center. She's a nationally recognized authority on political communication, local news, and the role of media in public discourse about politics and policy. She's co-authored many, many studies on all sorts of topics, including local news ecosystems, including assessing Oregon's local news and information ecosystem in this year, 2025, which is a follow-up to an earlier report published in 2022. Welcome, Regina. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Ben, for that nice introduction. And thank you. It's just been a pleasure to work with you and Damon and other folks at LNIC. And we're just excited because for many reasons, but one is that this is the first, I believe, am I right? The first kind of toolkit to be launched by LNIC.
Yes.
So thank you all for being here today. Looks like we got the poll results, but they kind of flashed on my screen and went right away. Oh, thank you. Okay, so wow, what an interesting, this is great. This is great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if I may, here. And do this. Can everybody see this okay?
Yes.
Thumbs up. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm so glad. Thank you for taking that poll, Ben, because I really wanted to emphasize a couple of things before we launch into some specifics about the toolkit. First of all, the process by which we designed this toolkit was based, in part on what we had learned, and my colleague Andrew David Gall is here on the webinar as well, what Andrew and I had learned in working with students here at the University of Oregon to build a database of local news organizations in Oregon in 2022. And then we refreshed that report just earlier this year. And we built on that. And then importantly, this work was really collaborative. So a lot of people within the LNIC working group on news, census, and ecosystem mapping, but also much more broadly beyond just that core working group. And in fact, some of those folks are on the call today. Joanna Dunaway is here, Sarah Stombley is here, and thanks so much because their insights and smarts made a big difference in the robustness, I think, of the toolkit that we were able to design. And I really want to emphasize that we really tried to design this toolkit for a broad range of users. So throughout the toolkit, we use the term researchers from time to time, but by that, we really mean whether you're experienced at doing local news system research or you're not really experienced, but you're doing the work. This toolkit really is intended for you, for that broad audience. So I'm going to start by kind of asking the question about why might you want to conduct a newsroom census? This can be a way of figuring out how much news production capacity exists in your community, your state, your region. Can be a way of figuring out what types of media are available, are thriving, are perhaps declining in your area. And it can also be a way of figuring out in what areas are local news outlets clustered? What areas of your region are have more access to local news, and which are in danger of becoming or may already be what we call a news desert, lacks access to actually true news. And this kind of census and mapping work can be critically important for different kinds of stakeholders. So first of all, many people on the call today research centers, civic organizations, journalism support organizations that want to kind of kickstart a conversation about the state of local news in your city, your county, your state, your region. A report like this, a project like this can be a great way to kickstart that conversation. For funders, philanthropists, want to think about where their investments could make the greatest impact. This is an excellent way to kind of really know the lay of the land. For policymakers who are paying attention to the crisis in the local news and they want to understand what kinds of policies might be most impactful based on the realities on the ground in their particular state. This information is valuable for them. And then also, of course, in particular, local press forward chapters who need to create a baseline understanding of the state of local news in their area. So for all of these kind of stakeholders and all different levels of research experience, that's what we have in mind here. Also, I do want to quickly point out something that we go into more detail on within the toolkit itself. And that is that there are several different approaches to mapping the health of local news in your particular community. You may decide that a newsroom census that we'll talk about today either is or is not the best place to start. We think that it's a valuable starting place for many other endeavors to try to bolster and improve the quality, the health of local news. But I just want to quickly differentiate between this process of simply documenting the newsrooms of all kinds that exist in your locale and kind of differentiating that from either looking closely at the content that they're producing. That is not something that this toolkit will tell you how to do. Although we may in the Q&A get into some of the overlaps and the ways that those two things can work together. But it's not really looking at the content so much as it is really just trying to understand what newsrooms, what news producers and distributors exist. It's also not the same thing as doing an audience analysis, where you're starting by asking people in your community, where did they turn for local news and information? Those are different projects that are being led, as Ben pointed out earlier, by different working groups. So just again, directing you back to the LNIC website that kind of gives an overview of those different working groups. So what this toolkit does is walks you through 5 basic steps to mapping local news in your ecosystem. And that includes defining the geographic boundaries of your work, deciding on the criteria for either including or excluding different kinds of sites, newsrooms, etc. And then how do you go about actually documenting all of the news outlets of various kinds that exist? And fourth, how do you gather information and what kinds of information can you gather on those newsrooms? And then finally, of course, doing some at least simple analysis and then publishing and sharing your findings. That's a lot to try to cover in the short amount of time that we have today. What I'm going to primarily focus on are some key decision points that you'll need to make along the way, or at least things you'll need to be thinking about if you decide to take this approach and do this analysis. So again, we'll talk a little bit about how you go about defining geographic boundaries and different ways you might think about that, how you decide what to include and possibly what to exclude from your counting, and then how do you, some basic decisions around creating that master list. And then we'll walk quickly through some very basic data points that we recommend that you gather that are relatively easy to gather. So if you're ready, start. So first, defining your geographic scope. And that really boils down to these kinds of questions. Now, the most obvious approach and the approach that most have taken is to do a statewide local news analysis. So you're mapping all of the news outlets that exist within state lines. And that's a very logical way to start. I just want to point out a couple of points on that to think about. First of all, as you know, in certain cities or regions of the country, they may be served by news media that are actually based out of state. So in Oregon, for example, people in Portland and along the northern border of the state are equally served by media that are just across the Columbia River in Washington state. So from one perspective, you may want to broaden your geographic scope and think about what are all the media outlets that serve your state, not just that are located within your state. On the other hand, focusing on the news outlets that are within the state lines is a useful approach, particularly if the aim is to document your state's own news production capacity. For example, in support of legislation or policy that might be helpful in bolstering local news in your state. It makes some sense to focus there. So that's just a note, something to think about. Secondly, deciding on inclusion criteria, I've just listed out on the slides some of the kinds of questions to consider. I'm going to kind of talk over that and make a couple of more meta points, if you will. It might seem self-evident that a newsroom mapping, newsroom census project would be focused on traditional news media. But as you all know, the information landscape has evolved so quickly and so dramatically that it is worthwhile to think carefully about whether you will include less traditional journalistic sites or not in your analysis. So, for example, as you know, in some communities that have lost their local newspaper altogether, citizens have come together to start a social media site to sort of cover the community. And sometimes that's being run or managed by people with journalism experience, sometimes without. And for some communities, that's become a main go-to source of local news and information, for better or for worse. So a key question is whether you want to try to include that kind of project, that kind of site in your own counting. Also, increasingly, and this is something that Sarah Stompoli has written a lot about, local civic organizations that are not journalistic or even news focused at all have really stepped in to provide vital kinds of local news and information for their communities. And so a key question is, do you want to stick with journalism and things defined as news, or do you want to look more broadly at the organizations that are providing vital civic information for your local community? So the bottom line is that in today's environment, a lot of information is being produced not only by journalists, but also by other kinds of organizations and individuals. We suggest in general being as inclusive as possible, given your own time, resources, and your strategic purposes in doing this work. So you sort of, there's a decision-making process here around again, deciding what to include and exclude, and then just being very clear about your criteria, your reasons for those criteria, and being very transparent in the way you talk about your findings. Now, it is important to think when we come to the question of how inclusive to be about whether to include certain kinds of sites like pretty explicitly partisan sites and or what are known as pink slime sites that are often algorithmically generated. That's an interesting discussion, and we've been in a lot of different conversations over the last 2 years as we've developed this toolkit, and I would say that viewpoints are kind of all over the map on this. So I might just quickly make the point here, we can talk about it more in the Q&A if you'd like, that there is some real value to documenting those sites because a lot of people may be turning to them because they do exist and they are circulating information, whether or not it's good quality information. But on the other hand, if you do that, you have to be, I think, extremely careful in how you communicate out your findings to really differentiate sites that observe journalistic norms and procedures versus those that appear that they don't. Then, moving on to the actual documenting of local newsrooms, it's just important to note that kind of the baseline starting place. You're probably doing this work precisely because no such master list exists of news outlets that you know of anyway in your geographic locale. And so there literally is not a single place that you're going to be able to turn to. Rather, you are the one who is creating this master list probably for the first time ever. So there's a lot involved in that, a lot of, reaching out to different kinds of sources, both online and also different ways that you can leverage the smarts and the experience of people in your communities to help you discover the news outlets that exist. Our toolkit offers links to all kinds of helpful online resources, as well as some strategies that you can use in terms of outreach to document all of the newsrooms that do exist. I'll quickly say that one interesting question then is whether you want to limit yourself, at least initially, to the newsrooms that can be identified online. They have an online presence. That's kind of that's a basic starting place that you for sure should try to do. The question is, should you also include newsrooms that have never gone digital, or even that are newer, that for whatever reason are not digital, they still exist on paper, for example? So that's a key question that I think each researcher, each organization has to decide for itself based on kind of local facts on the ground. Fourth, when we come to actually gathering data, it's a big question, like, what data am I gathering? What should I be looking for? There is a lot that you could do. So our toolkit tries to offer a couple of helpful things. First of all, we'll walk quickly through a basic list of basic variables, if you will, that we suggest that you gather. And we've also provided a spreadsheet, kind of a sample spreadsheet that you can use and modify as you need, just to kind of help you get organized as you're gathering data. So let me just sort of walk through some of the basic things that we recommend that you start with, because these are things that are relatively easy to find and can be tremendously useful to document. So obviously, the outlet name, the digital location or URL, and then the physical location, that is, if there is a bricks and mortar location, documenting what that address is. That will be especially important if you do want to do any literal mapping of news outlets, for example, to understand where they are clustered in your state. Having that physical address is really important. The founding year, which can be a valuable way of getting a sense of where there's been growth, the strength of legacy media, et cetera, in your state or your region. And then the media outlet type, and we offer some guidelines within the report. And this is, again, kind of a complex, potentially complex question. Like, what does it mean to talk about outlet type in this day and age? We had to put a lot of thought into this, actually. So just as a starting place, what we recommend, and you can dive into the toolkit and see it for yourself, is distinguishing outlets that are still print only, if you decide to include those. Certainly outlets that are digital only, and those are likely, of course, to be more recent, to be startups, et cetera. And then to include a category that is a pretty big category this day and age, which is print and digital, for example, newspapers that have gone digital. And then, of course, broadcast television and then radio. A key decision here, going back to inclusion and exclusion criteria, is whether you want to include commercial radio, because there can be a lot of commercial radio stations. They may not be providing very much news and information, and that may be a little hard to ascertain. What we did in Oregon, for what it's worth, is we just decided a priori we're not going to include commercial radio because so many studies indicate that they don't carry much local news at all. But that's, not the only approach. You could go ahead and document all of the commercial as well as the public radio stations, et cetera. So we offer those specific guidelines if you delve into the toolkit. And then finally, the frequency of publication can be useful to document. The community or the communities that the outlet says it is designed to serve can be very useful to document. And then we get into ownership and business model. And these last three variables, I believe, are really important, because a growing amount of research, including a lot of it done by Joanna Dunaway, who's here on the call today, shows that ownership and business model have a big impact on the amount and the quality of local news, actual local news, that news outlets are producing. So we recommend documenting, first of all, literally who is the owner, whether it's an individual, an in-state, small family-owned chain, whether it's an out-of-state chain, et cetera, just documenting who the owner is by name, and then the owner location, whether the owner of that outlet is based within your state or not, can be pretty powerful. For example, in Oregon, because we had done that in 2022, then we were able to really talk about the dramatic shift this past year as Carpenter Media, which is based in Mississippi, came in and bought up dozens of newspapers in the state of Oregon. We were able to show that shift. And then finally, business model. That's a whole big interesting conversation. For now, I'll just say we suggest that you start with a very, very simple dichotomy of simply, is this a commercially operated outlet, or is it nonprofit, or in the case of radio, for example, public radio? Because again, there's a big correlation between that underlying business model and the type of news that they're likely to produce. So the last point I'll make, and then we can move on to the Q&A, is a few observations about publishing and sharing data. So we recommend a couple of steps. First of all, pre-releasing your database. Once you've created your master list, you've gathered all of those basic data points and maybe whatever other information you decided to gather about the newsrooms in your locale, going ahead and pre-releasing that database to, for example, all the journalists and newsrooms that you may have a relationship with in the state, experts at local colleges and universities, journalism schools, et cetera. Getting some smart eyes on your database can help you both understand how readable you've made the database, and also may help you realize things that you had overlooked, maybe something you forgot to code, maybe a news outlet that had never emerged until somebody points it out to you. That kind of interactive, collaborative feedback can be really helpful. And then, of course, to publish your full master list and make it public, make it transparent. Of course, you got to protect it so that people can't go in and alter anything in it, but welcome people's input, establish some kind of a link that they can use to communicate with you as your information gets out there into the public, that they can, again, alert you to outlets you might have overlooked, for example. And obviously, probably most of you would be interested in producing some kind of a report. We can talk more about that if you're interested in talking about it, to highlight your key findings. And also, we recommend doing what we're doing today, which is some kind of a webinar and/or an in-person public event, because the power of these data, the power of gathering this information, is that it really can kickstart a pretty meaningful conversation about the state of local news in your community. So I hope that that's been helpful just as a general overview for what we're offering in this toolkit. And I think now we have lots of time for questions. And I think maybe Ben is going to moderate the Q&A for us.
Yes, thank you so much, Regina, for that really wonderful overview of the report. Again, the report itself is on the Local News Impact Consortium website. If you'd like to ask, we have lots of time for questions, so the Q&A is the best place to leave a question. While people are thinking about what they might want to ask, I'll just ask a question for you, Regina, following up on some of the last points you were talking about around publicizing, promoting a census that you may have done in your own state or community. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experience in Oregon with the Agora Center's report and some of the reaction or engagement from different kinds of stakeholders you heard from when that was first published.
Great. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And I'm mindful that Andrew is here as well on a lot of that public and journalistic engagement work. He actually had it up. So one thing that I remember really vividly is that when we did the initial report, that was the first time a database like this had been created for the state of Oregon. Andrew designed a gathering where we brought together folks from newsrooms around the state, but also civic and philanthropic organizations from around Portland, around the state. And we designed, I think it was a half day or most of a day event. So the report then became kind of a starting place to share what we were finding about the state of local news. And of course, at that point, it was the first time it had been done, so we couldn't really talk about trends. We could just talk about here's what is, right? And that day or half day, whatever it was really generative. Especially getting those different kinds of stakeholders in the room to think about how that data mattered, and then to think about, so what does this mean? Where should we go next? And then in 2025, I think something that was powerful is that by that time, Andrew had worked to facilitate a group that we call the Oregon Media Collaborative, which is dozens of newsrooms from around the state that have now kind of, signed on to work together to try to grapple with problems of local news around the state. And so that group became such a valuable resource. both for updating the database, making sure that we were updating it correctly, and then kind of, test driving some ideas that we wanted to talk about in the paper about things that had happened, such as the sale of so many local newspapers to an out-of-state owner. Like, how did that matter? Being able to have their smarts and their experience to help the report itself take shape was really powerful as well.
There's a question in the Q&A from Celia Wu about Substack newsletters, and I'm curious whether this was, I imagine, something the working group must have discussed in terms of inclusion, exclusion kinds of parameters. What was the thinking around things like newsletters in a community?
Yeah. I mean, Celia, hi, thanks for being here. If your question is, can a Substack be something valuable that might come out of this process? I would think absolutely, because it's kind of showing you where a lot of stories are to tell in your state or in your community, right? Because you can see, especially once you've done it more than once, again, you can see where the trends are. You can see who's new on the scene that you might want to feature. One thing that I would say, I'm going off your question a little bit here, but just speaking to the value of, if you do this newsroom census work once, committing to do it again at some repeated interval in the future can be really powerful. Because, for example, we were able in 2025 to go back and talk to a few newsrooms that we had featured in our first report in 2022 that were brand new. They were either digital or print, I don't even remember now, but they were small. They were starting new things with new models and new ideas. And then 3 years later, to be able to go back to them and to see the ways that they had grown, the ways that they had built trust with their communities, that was really powerful. And then getting back to Celia's question, that is the kind of thing that could be, ongoing storytelling that can come out of the report, but I'm not quite sure if that's what.
Yeah, no, thanks. Really, the question was, especially with so many journalists being laid off from your quote unquote mainstream newsrooms, right? That many journalists have committed to doing hyperlocal reporting, or I'm doing hyperlocal reporting, for instance, on the community I live, and I use Substack as my platform. So I think the question is yes, that would be counted as a legitimate news source that you would put into your count into the census, but I just wanted to confirm that. So,
oh, I see. I'm sorry, I
thank you.
completely missed. So thank you for clarifying. So I think the question is, would a Substack newsletter count as a newsroom, if you will?
Right.
And again, I mean, I think our answer in the toolkit is we try really hard to walk a line throughout the toolkit of saying, here's some things we strongly recommend and some things you'll really need to think about. But at the end of the day, whoever is doing this research is going to know their local context best. And you're going to know the larger purposes of doing the work that you're doing. So, for example, in Oregon, we didn't include any Substack newsletters, partly just because we had limited resources and time to produce this database. And I am not sure that I would have felt comfortable that I could identify all the Substacks out there that might be relevant, right? So because I wanted to make sure that I could vouch for the completeness of the database, we decided not to include, and we also didn't include social media sites, which is that's a huge thing to leave out in this day and age, right? So a little bit, it goes to, I think, how you're doing for resources and time.
Yeah, and I see a note in the chat from Jessica Ross who says that they included Substacks in their ecosystem mapping project that they did. We did not in the mapping work we did in Minnesota, mostly for the same reason, Regina, you were saying, which is just it's so much more challenging to have a comprehensive sense of what the local journalism newsletter universe might look like. I think one exception was Axios Local, which has a local newsletter in Minneapolis and Twin Cities. They have a lot of local chapters like that. It still exists primarily or entirely almost through their newsletter. They do a website, but it's those kinds of, I think, thorny questions that everybody doing this research has to be grappling with in terms of how you draw a line between what you're including and what you don't. And at least I think to your point around being transparent around what those criteria are for inclusion.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I think that's right, Ben, that, at the end of the day, whatever you decide, you have to be comfortable with it and then just make it ultra clear. Take every opportunity you can to help people understand what's included, what's not included, and why.
Damon, did you say you had a question?
I think Regina just almost answered this, but let me restate it, because I'm fascinated by this problem of media that crosses administrative political boundaries. Missouri has several cities, for instance, that don't fit neatly into a state border. And we have 63 towns that are in 2 different counties, for instance, which is frustrating. But I'm wondering how you think more. Can you say more about how you align your methods? You have your 10 variables that you had on that slide are all contested variables,
Mm.
the way you describe it. How are you thinking about aligning your research methods and those decisions on those contested variables, I guess? Like, what's that process look like to you?
Like, could you maybe point out one variable that seems really contested, really fraught?
If I'd written down the 10, well, the border, the inside and outside the
Mm.
state border is the example I thought of
Yeah.
first. You said if you're thinking about policy, maybe you're doing inside the border. If you're thinking about audience focus, it's across the border as well because it impacts, but that's a different research question.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I think first of all, that question first comes up as you're just deciding what's going to be the scope of your project.
Yeah.
And I think that's just inevitably tied to what is your strategic purpose,
Mm.
right? And you may not even, I mean, everybody on the call may not think that they have a strategic purpose. So maybe that's an interesting open question as well. But, to the extent that you want to do state-focused advocacy, for example, or you want to provide information to people who do state-focused advocacy, then it probably probably makes sense to focus on what exists within your state,
Mm.
right? But as a practical matter, as I mentioned, like people these days are getting, and we haven't even talked about yet, how people are getting a lot of their news and information, not from local sources whatsoever,
Mm.
right? So that people's actual media consumption is way messier, more complicated, more interesting than this sort of simple counting of newsrooms even begins to get us at. And that's why we also tried really hard to differentiate here between just figuring out what newsrooms exist versus going and talking to audiences, whether you're doing survey work, focus group work, whatever you're doing, to figure out where people are going to get their news and information, because that's an utterly different question, potentially,
Oh, oh, oh.
right?
This is all supply side as opposed to your point, the
Exactly.
audience is the demand side.
Exactly. This is about news production and distribution capacity.
Oh, oh. Ben, we have another question about AI.
Yeah, so I see there's another question from Celia about the increase in AI generated news, especially in the hyper-local space. I think this relates to the discussion you mentioned around whether to include the pink slime outlets, but of course we're seeing more and more of these AI generated sites existing, whether they're technically pink slime or not. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about maybe your own view on the matter or how you treated it in Oregon versus maybe some of the other perspectives on it.
That's great. It's such a good question. It's a nice example of what Damon was referring to as really
Yeah.
contested, right? Because first of all, you have to decide if you're going to exclude AI generated sites, like you decide we don't want to confuse the matter, so we're not going to include pink slime sites because we're just trying to figure out what exists that's more journalistic in nature. Then the fact is that unfortunately, or fortunately, either way, newsrooms, traditional newsrooms may be leaning into AI tools, maybe using AI in ways that you may know about or you may not know about. So the point really isn't like we're going to exclude anything that has to do with AI, right? It's really more in that case, we're trying to draw attention to kind of the nature of the enterprise itself, right? So the problem with pink slime is partly that it's AI generated in a way that I'm sure everybody here is quite aware of, tends to take a kind of a story format and just kind of, reproduce it across a lot of different local areas that may or may not be accurate or relevant to that local area. So it seemed to us that that sort of AI generated content, we just didn't want to confuse the matter by including that for Oregon. But I think there's a strong argument to be made that actually it could be very important to be very aware of those sites and then to be able to track them as well. Are there more of them? Are there fewer of them than a few years ago, for example, to be able to track over time? I feel like I've lost the thread a little bit of the question you were trying to get at, Ben, but
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's everybody who's been doing some version of this has tried to grapple with that same question and that tension around the value, especially when you think about the value of an interactive map that you're publishing that's, serving a lot of different stakeholders, but one of those stakeholders are members of the public, I think, who are trying to understand their own media environment, which is increasingly, so fragmented. There's so many different sites that people may not have heard of, and they're looking for information about who's behind these sites and what are they, and so the more I think you're able to your point, share not just that there is a site and it's included in your map, but details around ownership, details around maybe, I mean, in an ideal world, you'd have a sense of how many journalists are actually employed by each of these newsrooms as well, but that's a much bigger undertaking to establish. But the more information you're able to provide to the public about all this, the organizations and outlets that you're including, I think is a really valuable resource. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Otherwise, we might wrap up. If anybody has a question on their mind that they haven't had a chance to put in the Q&A, please do so.
I have one more. It's either maybe for Regina or you, Ben. How do we see this foundational, this census as we're calling it, fitting in with the other pieces of research that are necessary to get a full picture? Because this is one step.
Yeah, I'm so glad. That's a great question, Damon, because I really do think it's a pretty fundamental and important step. And it's also, again, so limited because I know I've already said it, but doing a newsroom census is so valuable. And it also really doesn't tell you much of anything about where people are actually getting their news and information, except, I mean, one thing it might tell you is that literally if people can't get local or, truly locally produced news in their particular area of your state, for example, this may tell you that. But yeah, and so I really think in an ideal world, you'd be able to do all these different kinds of pieces. So Ben just mentioned like a logical second step would be then to take your newsroom census that you've created and use that as a basis for doing what Jen is leading with her working group, which is figuring out how many journalists are actually employed anymore at these newsrooms in our state. And then you're able to say something about the importance of that as a labor sector in your state. And when you're talking about talking to policymakers, for example, you're again able to say a lot more about news production capacity when you're not just treating every newsroom as equal, right? Because obviously they're not in terms of what they're able to do. And then again, to be able to track gains or losses over time can be really powerful. That is a specialized undertaking, trying to measure newsrooms, the number of journalists that they have working for them and other kinds of staff is hard to do. It's specialized, and that's why we've got a whole other working group that's working just on that. And then another quick note would be to say, also doing the newsroom census doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the content of the news that's being produced. So I'll say a quick word about how doing a newsroom census is not content analysis, right? You're not really understanding what news is being produced, but you may use a very simplified type of content analysis as part of your inclusion or exclusion criteria. And that's what we did in Oregon. And it was very rough and very simple, and I'm happy to walk it through at some point if people are interested, but just kind of a couple of quick and relatively easy ways of figuring out whether a site that we were visiting seemed to be regularly producing original, local civic affairs or public affairs related content. And just even figuring that out was a big undertaking. It took a lot of hours to do it, and it's probably not perfect. But that then was a peek into the content that was being produced. And it also allowed us to say, we're pretty sure that this is a comprehensive list of the outlets that matter if you care about civic and public affairs news. These are the outlets that are producing it, right? So and again, doing a newsroom census isn't the same as knowing how big and how robust those newsrooms are. It's not the same as knowing what kind of content they're producing and the quality of that content. That's a different question. And it's also not the same, again, as knowing what people are actually paying attention to. But it is, I think, a really important foundational piece.
I think that's a really great point, and I think it also will highlight something that Damon and Matt are working on with their working group around computational methods for doing these sorts of content analyses at a larger scale, and I think that's something that we hope through the LNIC to be able to provide as a tool for researchers in the broader journalism support organization community to be able to do this work, analyzing the content beyond just whether there are outlets in a given location. And so that is something we are, as a sort of larger community, are working on developing as well.
Yeah. Jamie has a interesting question in the Q&A, Ben, about, and we hear this from a lot of press forward chapters, especially, who are looking to use these methods for two things. One is to learn about the audience, and two is to unlock funding in the local community. So that's more than just a newsroom census, but it's more of a broader research question for you, maybe.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, how to use this kind of process in order to do those other things?
Or is this research, can this research be used for both things, which is what many local newsrooms and funders are hoping to do with it? So it may be, it's more than a newsroom census question, it's a broader, the full research pipeline question, I think.
Yeah, the way I tend to think about it is as a kind of focusing point for a community to have as a shared resource, this sense of what is the sort of capacity for local news currently. I think it helps to identify where there are those gaps, especially if you're able to track changes over time. But to be able to track those changes over time requires doing it in a systematic way with this kind of rigorous framework around it, so that you're not just it's not just a sort of sense of what the environment looks like, but you're actually tracking it in a systematized way. I think that can be a very powerful way to identify where there are needs. It also, to the point that was raised earlier, it's a starting point for doing these other kinds of analyses that really are only possible if you have that list to begin with. It also allows for comparison. If you're doing this with established methods, you can compare one community to another community where the methods you've used are comparable across these places. So not just over time change, but how how the ecosystem in Alabama looks compared to Oregon, for example, to better get a sense of where the needs are most acute.
Yeah. All right. Very good.
If we could, so we'll wrap up, but I have one final question for Regina to sort of close the conversation. I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about what's next for this working group. I know that you have a lot more on your plate as the interim dean at Oregon. What can you say about what's happening next with this working group?
Yeah, and actually, maybe I'll just quickly, I had forgotten, I did have this final slide because I wanted to give a big shout out to Joanna Dunaway, who is going to be taking over being the lead for the working group on Newsroom Census. So I'm super grateful to Joanna, and she is just a hands down expert in this area. So I put her contact information there as well. So I think we are in a moment of deciding, what is going to be the best next step. I think for right now, we've been focused on trying to get the toolkit complete. Now it's out there. I think we're eager to hear from people as you begin to try out the toolkit and see what's useful, maybe if there are things that aren't clear, things that we overlooked. I think we're really very eager to have feedback on it so we could, refine it as need be over time. So I think that's the big message I'd want to leave with is please send us your questions, your ideas, your suggestions.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of our participants for joining us today. Thank you, Damon. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Regina. It's been great to see all of you, and I hope this was helpful for those who tuned in.